Hello and welcome again on the Vintage Aviation News YouTube channel. Today it's another episode of Behind the Collection, and I guess I don't have to tell you where I am because it's pretty self-explanatory. We are in Pensacola, home of naval aviation, home of the National Naval Aviation Museum, and we have a special visit today. In fact, we are going to meet Hill Goodspeed, the Deputy Director of the museum. I'm going to sit down with Hill, talk about the museum, the current plans and the future plans, and talk about a few of the restorations. Exciting, it's a very exciting visit. Don't forget to activate the bell and click subscribe so you'll be notified every time we go live. It's very hot here, as you can see. So we'll go inside and we'll meet with Hill. And again, thanks for watching. Hill, thanks for having us here at the museum. We really appreciate your time. And it's one of the greatest museums there is in the United States and probably in the world. So the Mecca or the home of naval aviation. You've been a historian at the museum for 25 plus years. Starting early 2023, you became the deputy director.
Yes.
Why don't you walk us through your whole background of being an historian, becoming a director, and then we'll move on to the next phase of the interview.
Sure. Well, I'm a Pensacola native, actually. My grandfather got his wings of gold here in 1941. So a grandson of a naval aviator and son of a Marine officer, actually. So I've been actually visiting this museum since I was a little kid. And I started working here in the early 1990s and was the historian here for many, many years. So a great experience to be able to tell the story of naval aviation at a museum that's located on board the Navy's first air station in Pensacola. And fortunate enough to be named the museum's deputy director and started that new position in early 2023. So it's been a great career here, shifting to a new dynamic from the historian to more of an administrative role. But it's just as you said, it's sort of the Mecca of naval aviation, the crossroads of naval aviation, and just an incredible place to work and a really rewarding career because you get to really share not only the technology of naval aviation, but more importantly, the personal stories of those who've really come through the ranks of naval aviation since it first began back in 1911.
Outstanding. So the museum started developing in the mind of Tuttle, Admiral Tuttle, if I'm correct, if I'm correct, in 1955. But it didn't really, like many other museums, there are visionaries that see the opportunity or the need for an aviation museum, but then it took quite a few years before the museum became a reality.
Right.
So why don't you walk us through the timeline of when the museum, from being a concept, an idea of an admiral, became an actual naval aviation museum?
Sure. It started in the minds of Rear Admiral Magruder Tuttle, who had been a Naval Academy football player of some note, and then went into naval aviation in his career, served in World War II. And you remember in the mid-1950s, you're at the height of early days of the Cold War. So there was a tremendous influx of individuals who were coming into naval aviation, and naval aviation had really come of age in World War II. And Admiral Tuttle wanted to create a place, and his mindset was not so much the general public at the beginning. It was more to educate the flight students who were coming into naval aviation as to the struggles that had occurred in the early history of naval aviation to get it off the ground and what it had done during World War II, because he wanted them to have a greater appreciation for the profession they were entering. And that was really what the concept was. It was more for those in uniform. And then once it was built and the opportunity came about to really show the story of naval aviation, not to only those in uniform, but the general public, the taxpayers who support it, that was just a byproduct of what his initial vision was. And so that's why it is really located here in Pensacola, because the Admiral Tuttle and another admiral named Bernard Streen were in the training command, and that was the focus, was those going through training. So that's why it really was kicked off here in Pensacola.
From 1955, when Tuttle had the vision, we went to, I have here a note, in 1963. That's when the museum was established, so about 8 years, and tells the folks out there that even back in the days, it was not as easy to establish a museum, because I'm sure they had to do a little bit of, I guess, establish some political connection with Washington, the DoD, the Department of the Navy. And 1963, that's when the museum opened.
That's correct, and you're right. I mean, there was a lot of groundwork that needed to be laid. Both if it was going to be a museum owned and operated by the Navy, certainly you needed to secure some funding for it, a location, and all the sorts of procedures that you need to go through to establish the museum. And it opened its doors in June of 1963, and the building it was housed in was nothing. It was it was an old World War II era administrative building that couldn't house hardly any aircraft at all. And what aircraft they were able to acquire before the museum moved to this site, where we are now in the early 1970s, were displayed outside, and that was only a couple of them. And so an important thing to note, though, and when it opened in 63, it laid the groundwork. At least there was a place for people to donate their artifacts. There was a place that for the Navy to point to, like, okay, this is going to be the place where we store our history. And so even though the museum could not house a lot of aircraft initially, it was actively collecting them. So if there were certain aircraft that were coming out of service that were historic, the Navy would make a point of acquiring them. And a great example is our A-1H Skyraider, which is a Vietnam-era aircraft. It was the last Skyraider in the Navy to fly an attack mission, and it retired from active service in 1968. And it was flown here to Pensacola and housed until we could put it into the new museum. And that was an example of an aircraft that, if there had not been a museum, would have gone to the boneyard, would have been scrapped, and lost to history. But because there was a museum, as small as it was, it at least there was a foundation for where we are today.
And you mentioned the foundation. So the next, pivotal point in the history of the museum, I noted here 1966, when the Naval Aviation Museum Association, back then now Foundation, was essentially set up. Can you talk about the purpose of the foundation and why it was actually set up?
Absolutely. Well, there's, for the Navy Museum, Naval Aviation Museum, as far as the federal budget's concerned, there's only so many dollars to go around in the U.S. Navy's budget. And the museum, we don't launch any aircraft. We don't repair any aircraft. We don't send individuals or train them to go into combat. So we compete against all other entities within the Navy. And so, like most official military museums, be it the U.S. Air Force Museum, the National Museum of the Marine Corps, there are support foundations that are established. And those support foundations, their role is to serve as a 501c3 charitable organization to accept donations and raise money to support the National Naval Aviation Museum. And the most significant way the foundation supports the museum, especially in the early days, was the construction of it. And so all the buildings that we have here, the main museum buildings, be it Hangar Bay 1 or the main South and West Wing and the Blue Angel Atrium, what have you, all of the money to build those buildings was raised by our foundation. And then the way it works is the foundation then turns those buildings over to the Navy to operate. So the museum, there's two entities. There's a museum itself, which is owned and operated by the Navy, and the staff that runs the museum, myself included, are Navy employees. And then there's the 501c3 foundation. So it's definitely a team effort to support each other and try to make the museum as the best facility it can possibly be.
Next question I have, you partially answer in your what you just said. A lot of the aviation enthusiasts that read magazines, are on social medias, watch these YouTube channels and whatnot, they always point fingers. Oh, the Air Force and the Navy, the Marines should do better at preserving aircraft. But I would like for you maybe to explain the other side of. And I feel like the Air Force and the Navy, their mission is really not to run a museum or to save every single airframe they ever produce. So if you're able, why don't you give us a little bit of the other side of the coin explanation of why the Navy or the Air Force can't simply preserve every single airframe out there.
Right. Well, part of it is just the histories of the respective organizations and just the nature of the respective organizations. The Air Force actually has done a pretty good job of doing it over the years because they established their museum much earlier than the Navy did for aviation. And so they made a conscientious decision to try to save as many examples as possible. And so the Navy was behind in doing that, quite honestly. Plus, it's the nature of the Navy's mission. The Navy, if you go aboard an aircraft carrier, for example, there is very limited space. And so the mindset of saving things you don't really need really runs against that very limited space that Navy operations routinely entail in the form of carriers and other ships. And so it was really just being late to the game as far as the recognizing the need. And unfortunately, I mean, aircraft are made to be, they're pieces of equipment when they're in service. They're not, once they outlive their useful service life, be it dropping bombs or delivering supplies, and something better comes along. The mindset is not to expend money to save them; it's to move on from them. And so you have to have people who recognize the history of specific things, the heritage of them, and to save as much as possible. But getting started, the museum opened in 1963, as we talked about. The Navy bought its first aircraft in 1911, so that's the gap you had to live with as far as many aircraft just
to play catch up,
just being lost to history.
Yeah,
playing catch up, absolutely.
We go back a little bit to the timeline of the museum. Reading your article that it's on I think U.S. Navy history side, you mentioned in 1990 Captain Rasmussen became, actually you mentioned that
A little bit earlier,
but it seems to me another pivotal point in the history of the museum because he recognized the need of completing the collection. At that point, the museum, like many other museums for that matter, was accepting airplanes really to fill the museum's mission and maybe the space, including, it's my understanding, a 824 Banshee that was portrayed as a SBD.
Correct.
Because you needed an SBD, but you didn't have it. So he decided to go, and after those aircraft that were sunk in Lake Michigan, in order to complete the World War II collection that at that point was missing. So to me, that's another pivotal point in the history of the museum. So why don't you talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. It's I was very fortunate to have started here at the time that program was really kicking off. And it was an exciting time to work here because, like you said accurately, we had examples of World War II aircraft that an Air Force version of a Dauntless that we painted or portrayed as a Navy Dauntless, but there just weren't a lot of actual combat veterans or actual aircraft with significant histories from that World War II timeframe that made such a name for naval aviation in World War II. So when the discoveries were made in Lake Michigan, and it's not like no one knew that the two carriers that operated in Lake Michigan wasn't. It's just
nobody thought about it.
Nobody really thought about it.
Are you able? This is another question that as we speak, things come up. So Captain Rasmussen said, "Well, we have those Navy airplanes at the bottom of the lake. How did he go from thinking that, discussing it with you guys, and then I assume going to the Department of the Navy and say, look, this is what I would like to do."
There were all sorts of I was pretty junior at that time, so I wasn't really privy to a lot of the background of how he went about it. But certainly you had to work with salvagers in Lake Michigan to determine whether it was even feasible to bring these things up. You had to work with the state historic preservation offices of the respective states around Lake Michigan to get their buy-in for things. You had to make determinations of where the aircraft were. Also, if you found a wreck, it had someone been killed in that wreck, because that could be considered a war grave. So you did not want to disturb.
Do you recall if the Navy was open to the idea of?
I think the Navy was open to the idea because as long as there was sponsorship money to help make it happen, sure. The Navy was open, and so what the result was, we were able to take aircraft that had been in freshwater. cold freshwater, and they were really, they were battered, and they had had the effects of being underwater for a long time. But if you compared to pulling something up from salt water,
Yeah.
they were actually in relatively good shape. Relative being an operative word, and luckily at the time we had like we do now, a very skilled restoration staff that could actually bring some of these aircraft back to life as far as through restoration and what have you. And so so we went from aircraft from a World War II section that didn't have a lot of authenticity to it, I would say, to having a Battle of Midway veteran SBD Dauntless, to a F-4 Wildcat that flew in the Neutrality Patrol. We now have an F-6F Hellcat with a certified combat history. And that not only here, we have some of these aircraft on loan throughout the United States, because a lot of people don't realize that even though you come to Pensacola, you walk through our museum and you see approximately 150 aircraft, there's over 1,000 that we have cognizance over and responsibility for throughout the United States and even in foreign nations. And so that is our part of our outreach program, I guess you could say, loaning those aircraft out. So it was an exciting time and a pivotal time, and really it coincided with the World War II anniversaries. You're talking about the 90s, so your 50-year anniversaries, which had a lot of celebratory and commemorations. Celebration's not the right word, but a lot of commemorations that were occurring around that time. World War II was brought back to the public consciousness in an even greater way, and to have these amazing artifacts of World War II in the form of these aircraft and the stories they told and the people who once flew them that we were able to reintroduce to the public. It was a real exciting time.
So we are in the mid 90s at that point. That was the first time when I moved to the United States. I visited the museum in the mid 90s, and I came back multiple times. Today in 2024, obviously the most current time. But it seems to me, since the mid 90s up to today, every time you come back here, you see something new. So the museum had a amazing progression on expanding the exhibits, make it more kids friendly. So why don't you talk about the mid 90s all the way where we are now, essentially?
Well, we never stop accumulating artifacts or historical things. I mean, we, as the Navy's official museum for aviation, if there's an aircraft that is about to be retired from service, an aircraft type, and the F-14 Tomcat, which I'll use as an example, we're able to pick which one we would like to have. And so that we'll have aircraft coming in from the fleet. So some exciting additions we've had over the years is the last F-14 Tomcat to fly a combat mission. We have both of the F-18 Hornets that shot down Iraqi MiG-21s on the first day of Operation Desert Storm. We have the S-3 Viking that President George W. Bush made a carrier landing in on board USS Abraham.
And that's one of the 3 aircraft that he flew in that you have at the museum.
Well, we have 3 presidential aircraft.
Okay.
Yeah, one was flown in the Nixon and Ford administrations. One was flown by George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, during his World War II flight training. And the Navy one was the one George W. Bush flew in when he landed aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln during the Iraqi freedom.
And I do see a lot of interactive exhibits. Obviously, the museum now is paying attention a lot to young generations that people like you and I grew up going to museums, looking at the sign and spending hours looking at the airplane. But newer generation or the younger generation is very much interactive. So
absolutely,
I see a lot of that at the museum throughout the years. And can you briefly touch that?
That's something we are constantly trying to grow. I mean, we have people like to be engaged. You referenced coming to museums as when we were kids. You were content to see something in a case and read about it. With the technology we hold in our hands in the form of our phones, like many computers, it offers an opportunity, and there's an expectation among us, young and old. There's an expectation to have instant information, engaging information that is not so passive. So that's one thing I think we can do a better job of. and keeping pace with that technology. But yes, that's something that I think is a great initiative for us going forward, is to make, we've accumulated a lot of amazing aircraft, but we need to make them come to life better. And if you think back to when the museum first got started, and in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a lot of people that came in here had a direct connection to that aircraft. Either think of the millions of people who served in World War II. Many of them had experienced those aircraft, heard their engines, knew what they did, and then even their children had an appreciation because maybe dad and mom had talked about it. Now you're getting the generations are so far removed from that you have to really make these aircraft come to life for them, and take the stories that great grandfathers would have told and bring them to life in a very engaging, interactive way. And
since you're talking about exhibits and engaging, what do you think is the most overlooked display or exhibit at the museum, or one of the exhibits that visitors must see and very often gets overlooked?
Well, I think I'd say an aircraft. There's one aircraft that gets overlooked, and it's suspended, so it's hard at this juncture to have a story of great depth down below it. But if I were to tell people, when you come in, find this aircraft, read the sign about it, and appreciate what it represents, it would be an O-1 Bird Dog, which is a little observation aircraft, 2-seat, and it's suspended in Hangar Bay 1. It has markings on it from a country that doesn't even exist anymore, South Vietnam. And the story behind it is that a South Vietnamese Air Force major, his wife and 5 children, escaped from South Vietnam in that very aircraft, and the father landed on the USS Midway, an aircraft carrier, having likely never seen an aircraft carrier in his life until the day he made that landing. And so what that aircraft represents is literally a family's passage to freedom. And so it's very unassuming. It's surrounded by warbirds, Tomcats, Sky Raiders, Phantoms, mid-killer aircraft, and yet the powerful story of what it represents is something I think people, if they knew, should be one that they should see.
That's beautiful. What does the museum see as the most important initiative?
I think the important initiative is what we've talked about before, which is making this place more engaging to a modern visitor. And then the second one I would say is to expand it in such a way that we're able to protect more of the aircraft. There are aircraft that have been on the flight line that we've had for decades, and Florida is a very harsh place for metal things outside. Usually when we're across not miles away from the Gulf of Mexico and the heat. So it's to preserve and protect those aircraft.
You gave me the perfect assist for the next question. Yes. Obviously, a lot of readers, viewers, and naval aviation enthusiasts are wondering, what is the museum going to do with those aircraft that are sitting out there? Is there a plan to house them in a new building, or restore them and send them to another museum, or just send them to another museums? What is the plan for those aircraft?
It's a mixture of all of what you said. Okay. We've started an initiative of if there are aircraft that we know we can't care for because of their size, or we already have another example, we are actively loaning them to other museums where they will be a centerpiece, perhaps, for that museum to display. And we've done that on a number of occasions to other museums, and that's something that museums typically do. The NC-4, for example, is on loan from the Smithsonian. It has been since the mid-'70s. So it's a way. It's even though it's still we are conducting our mission of preserving naval aviation history, but that doesn't mean we have to do everything here on site.
Sure.
So that's what we're doing there. There is an active effort or there will be, we want to build another museum structure. But as many of your readers or viewers may know, in 2019, there was a very tragic terrorist shooting on board NAS Pensacola where 3 active duty military personnel were killed. And what that did is for a long period of time, that closed NAS Pensacola to the general public. And what that did is it certainly impacted any fundraising initiatives. It set us back for a little time. And we're getting our momentum back now that the general public is allowed back on the base. So that is something we have to overcome. We're finding we have to really reintroduce ourselves to the public, because if you take the terrorist shooting and you take COVID, we really have to say, hey, we're back. Here's what we are all about. And so I said there will be another wing at some point, but it's going to be a little while before I think we start that fundraising initiative to make that happen.
You mentioned we were talking about preserving and working with other museums to restore or preserve aircraft. Can you bring us up to speed with the latest Navy aircraft recovery policy?
Well, the Navy always, it's unique. The basis of any Navy policy is if you look at an aircraft history card, which is a record of an aircraft service in the Navy, and you find one that crashed, for example, it'll say stricken, big stamp, and that means stricken from the Navy's inventory. Well, the Navy never relinquishes title to those aircraft, so they're still Navy property in situ where they lie. That is the fundamental basis of when someone finds an aircraft. The policy is to go to the Navy and say, I've found this aircraft. And we at the museum, we are part of something called the Naval History and Heritage Command, based in Washington, D.C. They run Navy's museums, history programs, and also they have an underwater archaeology program, what have you. But what happens is the background of that particular aircraft is provided to the Naval History and Heritage Command. And if it's underwater, for example, and even if it's on ground, there are archaeological surveys done of it. There's history research done to make sure that no one was killed in that particular accident. Because the Navy and the military take that very seriously. It's like a ship at sea. You know, if you can read in the news almost any month, and with all the underwater research going on, they find the wreck of a submarine, but you have to remember, yeah, that's cool. It's a great wreck, but it's the final resting place for a number of people. So that's something that should not be disturbed. And so that's one thing the Navy does, is look and make sure. And then the salvager goes through if there's an interest in the Navy having that aircraft, because we really don't let a salvager just pull it up and then do what they want with it. There's got to be an interest in the Navy having that aircraft, adding it to the Navy's collection, either to display here or to display somewhere else. And so there's a permitting process and a permission process. And then a lot of times, if you have to work through government agencies of the states where the items are found, and I think I referenced earlier that they're state historic preservation officers in the states adjoining Lake Michigan. So you have to work with them because they have their own rules and regulations in their state water. So it's a big complex process that has become a little more detailed as time has passed, and we've raised more and more aircraft over the years.
Perfect. Well, to conclude this first part of the interview, what are the greatest challenges for the museums in the next 5 years?
The greatest challenge is, I would say, I think always with museums, it's staying relevant. There's so much people can do for entertainment. It's with your phone, what you could once go to a museum, and that would be the only place you could find that information or what have you. People can look on their phone, get a piece of information in a very quick period of time. So what our biggest challenge, I would say, is to draw people. If they come here, they make an effort to come here, and we need to show them something that they can't find anywhere else, they can't see anywhere else, they can't experience anywhere else. And so, because it's a competitive environment for people's time and their energy and their resources. And I think that's always the biggest challenge for any museum, is to stay relevant, to stay fresh, to stay exciting, and to collect things that tell a really compelling story. And And there's always the challenge in any museum is caring for what you have. And that's universal because and understanding, because when you collect something, when somebody brings something to you, when an airplane arrives, you're duty bound to care for it. And that takes money, that takes resources, and caring for what you have is always a challenge.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for having us. Now I'm gonna walk the floor and hopefully the restoration hangar, but we appreciate your time, and again, thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely, Moreno. It's been my pleasure.